Just past midnight on October 26, 1942, on a ridge above Henderson Field, Sergeant Mitchell Paige panted behind a machine gun, soaked with sweat, the last man standing on his stretch of the line. His platoon had been torn apart. The rest of the line had either fallen back or been wiped out. 3 machine guns remained, each one loaded. A fresh ammo belt slung across his back, another stacked beside the tripod. If the Japanese broke through, the airstrip would be overrun by dawn, and Guadalcanal would fall. There was no help on the way, nothing left but himself. He tightened his grip on the gun. In the trees ahead, something moved, fast, closer than before. They were coming again. Mitchell Paige, born on August 31st, 1918, was the youngest of 9 kids in a Serbian household. As immigrants, they balanced old country traditions with the hope of a better life in the United States. He grew up hearing stories of courage from his mother, Mika, stories of ancestors who never backed down. At the same time, she'd also make a point to teach him to love the Stars and Stripes. Every year on Armistice Day, Mihailo and his mother rode the bus to nearby McKeesport to watch veterans march, men who had faced war and survived. Mihailo never forgot the first time he saw them. Recalling the event, he later said, quote, "I was so impressed with these men that I told my mother, someday I want to be one of those." Those men, he would later learn, were U.S. Marines. By the time he turned 18, the Great Depression had drained hope for towns like Charleroi. Jobs were scarce, and future prospects for everyone were thin. Mihailo wasn't going to just sit around and wait for his luck to change. He celebrated his birthday by lacing up his boots and walking over 200 miles to the nearest Marine Corps recruiting office in Baltimore. Before he left, his mother stopped him at the door. She pressed her hand to his shoulder and said, quote, "Trust in God. Don't try to figure everything by yourself. Those Marine Corps sergeants will tell you what to do. Just trust in God." In September 1936, Mihailo signed the dotted line. At Paris Island, the boy from Charleroi was broken down and rebuilt. He thrived in the crucible. Then came Quantico, advanced infantry training, marksmanship, and leadership. Somewhere along the way, Mitchell Paige became Mitchell Paige. Like many first-generation Americans, he chose something simpler, easier for sergeants to shout and officers to remember. Mitchell Paige fit the uniform. It also fit the country he'd chosen to serve. USS Wyoming was no longer a warship, at least not officially. But to the Marines packed aboard her decks, she still barked like one. Converted into a gunnery training vessel, Wyoming steamed from the Panama Canal to California, with her steel belly full of thunder and young recruits hungry for fire. Among them was Private Mitchell Paige. Life aboard moved with a grinding momentum, each day a blur of clanging metal, shouted orders, and the sting of salt in the air. Paige fell into the rhythm of drills and live fire, loading the big guns until his shoulders ached and his ears rang. In there, discipline was beaten into muscle and reflex, one recoil at a time. And for Paige, the sea was only the beginning. His next post was at Cavite Naval Base in the Philippines. Off-duty, he pitched for the Marine baseball team. His fastball came in hot and wild, enough to make Navy batters flinch. For Paige, it was an opportunity to prove to himself that he could thrive under pressure and make sure that when the moment required it, he wouldn't miss. Eventually, Paige was shipped to China. His destination was Tientsin, a city cracked into foreign zones after the Boxer Rebellion. The Americans had a small concession there, a sliver of real estate surrounded by uneasy allies. British, French, Russian, and Italian forces, all watching one another and waiting for something to break. Paige's orders were to guard U.S. interests, the train lines, the embassy compound, and the flow of goods and personnel. One afternoon, Paige was unpacking his gear in the squad bag. As he upended one of his sea bags, a solid iron cannonball he'd been lugging all the way across the Pacific dropped out with a heavy thump. It had been planted there by his Marine buddies as a prank. That alone caught the attention of a stocky Marine who asked him, quote, "Do you fight? How much do you weigh?" That night, Paige was in the ring, subbing in for a sick Marine in a smoker bout against a Belarusian fighter. Neither man knew much about boxing, but they slugged through 3 brutal rounds. Bloodied and exhausted, they ended in a draw, just enough for the Marines to win the night. The 5th Marines began conducting cycling maneuvers through the Caribbean, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Canal Zone, testing new amphibious tactics in the harsh environment of the jungle heat. Paige trained on the beaches near Guantanamo Bay and Vieques Island, where the sand burned and every step was a rehearsal for the real thing. They practiced ship-to-shore landings under live fire, learning to move quickly, dig deep, and fight wet. One day, they'd storm enemy shores, and these were their dress rehearsals. Back stateside, Paige traded his rifle for a hammer. At New River, North Carolina, he helped raise the bones of what would become Camp Lejeune. The site was still more mud than structure back then, swampy, raw, and crawling with mosquitoes. But the work mattered. Paige and the men around him knew they were laying the foundation for something much bigger than barracks. They were preparing the Corps for the storm ahead. And then it came. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had hit America hard. Battleships burned. 1,000 lives had been lost. Then the orders came down. It was time. Paige was now a leader, tasked with transforming raw recruits into battle-ready soldiers. He drilled his men hard, because he knew they didn't have time to waste. The enemy wasn't coming. They were already here, and they were already winning. His unit, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, began gearing up for deployment. No one knew exactly where they'd be sent, but the rumors all pointed west, into the Pacific, into the jungle, and into a future as unforgiving as it was uncertain. By late October 1942, Mitchell Paige was no rookie. With 6 years in the Corps and stripes on his sleeve, he was a battle-hardened machine gunner and a platoon sergeant who drilled his men until they could strip a Browning blindfolded. He wouldn't have to wait long to see all of that effort put into practice. A storm broke at Guadalcanal. In August, Marines had stormed the island and seized Henderson Field, a half-finished airstrip the Japanese had carved from the jungle. By September, Paige and his unit were rushed in as replacements. They needed fresh troops for a defense that was already unraveling. If the airfield fell, the Japanese would split the Pacific, isolate Australia, and reverse every inch of Allied progress. From far off, the islands looked like paradise. Green hills, crashing waves, skies that could have been pulled from a postcard. But when Mitchell Paige landed in Samoa with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in 1942, it was a different story. The air was rotten. Mud clung to their boots like glue. Leeches latched onto their legs. And the rain never let up, falling in sheets until it felt like the whole jungle was more water than solid ground. Paige adapted fast. He learned to slip through undergrowth that swallowed the sun, to crawl without a sound, to stay dry when nothing else did. Hunger followed him. Sleep rarely found him. The war hadn't even begun, and he could already feel it under his skin. The enemy didn't fight clean. They shelled the ridgelines, crawled through the jungle by night, and vanished before daylight. They knew the terrain. They attacked without warning. One moment quiet, the next screaming charges and bayonets in the dark. The jungle fought for them. Foxholes collapsed under rain. Snipers picked off the careless. Fever claimed the weak. Even the nights were hostile. Paige dug in with the men around him. They were low on rest and short on supplies, surrounded by danger. On the night of October 24th, rain hammered the jungle like gunfire. Paige and his men crept into position atop the ridge south of Henderson Field, setting up under the crack and thud of Japanese artillery. Visibility was zero. Paige pressed his ear to the ground, the rain running down his face, and caught it. Voices. Just 30 yards below. He recognized the language. Japanese. He'd heard it before, back in China. Reaching for a grenade, he whispered orders to his men. Then, like a pitcher on the mound, he lobbed the first one. Paige had forgotten to take into account the resistance of his dungaree sleeves, lessening his accuracy somewhat. Still, his surprise attack seemed successful. A heartbeat later, a chorus of grenades followed his. The jungle erupted with sudden explosions. Then, nothing but silence. Sleep didn't follow afterward. The fear of a counterattack kept them wired. At dawn, Paige led a patrol down the ridge. They found 4 or 5 Japanese bodies, half hidden by brush, with fading red smears trailing into the tree line. No one dared follow. Everyone knew the enemy had a habit of dragging off their fallen comrades, denying Marines trophies, intelligence, or closure. There was also the possibility that they could fall into a trap. Later that morning, Paige pulled out his kabar and went to work on his uniform. He wasn't taking any more chances. Quote, "It took nearly 2 hours to cut those sleeves off. But if I wanted to throw hand grenades again, I wanted to make sure I wasn't hampered by my sleeves." A thick, wet blackness settled over the jungle near Henderson Field on the evening of October 25th, 1942. Deep in the jungle below, faint lights flickered like warnings. The quiet clinking of gear and hushed movements made it clear that the Japanese were close, just out of sight, getting ready to attack. Under cover of darkness, Paige and his platoon shifted their .30 caliber Browning rifles into fresh positions, carefully adjusting their line without giving away their movements. Flashlights were out of the question. Even if visibility was near zero, the threat was clear. They dug in as best as they could. After weeks of non-stop movement, most of the men had long since discarded their entrenching tools. They found them too bulky and heavy for jungle warfare. Instead, they used bayonets, knives, and even bare hands to hack shallow fighting holes into the rocky ridge. It was slow, brutal work, but there was no choice. The soil was stubborn, laced with roots, and the ridge offered little in the way of natural cover. Around 2 a.m., Paige caught something in the air. A whisper. A few muffled words in Japanese. The enemy was getting close, maybe 100 yards away. He crawled from gun to gun, alerting each exhausted Marine. Some stirred groggily, while others were already awake, clutching their weapons. Then the jungle cracked as the sound of branches snapping enveloped the silence, and web gear scraped over bark. The sounds were unmistakable. The Japanese were charging. Out of the darkness surged a wall of bodies, shouting and charging, their sabers drawn. Paige grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and hurled it with his newfound precision. Then another and another. Explosions lit the trees in stuttering flashes. He'd cut his sleeves off hours earlier for this very moment. He roared the order to fire. The ridge erupted in muzzle flashes. Paige dropped 2 soldiers with his rifle, then turned and shot a third who had just bayoneted a fellow Marine. The fight became a melee. Mud, fists, bayonets, and shouting were being thrown all around with disregard for any order or formation. Around him, Marines fought tooth and nail to hold the line. Paige moved from gun to gun, clearing jams, unspooling belts, helping the wounded fire what they could. Then he felt something hot on his hand. A burst from a number-light machine gun slammed into his weapon. The feed mechanism was gone. His gun was out, and the enemy was still coming. The Japanese assault had struck so fast, so fiercely, that entire Marine squads evaporated in minutes. Company F, to Paige's left, was flattened. Company G, on his right, was pouring their last rounds into the dark. Every machine gun in Paige's platoon was knocked out, either destroyed or abandoned by fallen and wounded gunners. He barely had time to think about it, as he was, quote, too busy shooting as fast as he could and trying to get a bead on the coming Japanese troops. Paige ran back and forth between broken guns, clearing jams, grabbing ammo belts, and firing wherever the enemy surged. The Japanese must have suspected that dozens of men were holding that line. All of a sudden, as Paige leaned over his weapon to reload, something stopped him cold. It felt like slamming into a stone wall. For a heartbeat, he couldn't move. Just then, a warm breeze grazed his throat, right between his chin and Adam's apple. It was the whisper of bullets. The Japanese machine gunner, crouched just yards away, had unleashed his entire 30-round magazine at point-blank range. He'd perfectly sighted Paige's head and left shoulder during the first pull of the reload. But somehow, through instinct or luck, Paige had shifted just enough to dodge every single shot. The Japanese gunner lowered his weapon, thinking Paige was finished. But Paige hurled himself over his gun and ripped the bolt back for a second time. The belt snapped into place. He swung the weapon and unleashed a burst straight into the enemy gunner, dropping him before he could realize his mistake. Soon after, with the adrenaline at full blast, Paige draped 2 belts of ammunition over his shoulders, unclamped a Browning machine gun, and yelled to the Marines behind him, quote, "Fix bayonets and follow me." Marines from Company G, rallied by Paige's roar, joined in. The Japanese broke ranks, stumbling backward into the jungle as dawn broke. they left nearly 98 bodies on the ridge, with hundreds more in the ravine below. Dawn was creeping over the ridge, and Paige located a third machine gun and abandoned the borrowed one. Enemy bullets tore around him. 3 Marines scrambled to bring him ammo. Even if they were wounded, they were adamant about delivering their belts to him. Paige swung the new machine gun around and fired into the trees, cutting down Japanese soldiers who had slipped past the line and were racing downhill toward the battalion command post. Once again, Paige called for his men to follow him. He hefted another Browning and led the charge downhill. As he advanced, a Japanese officer leveled his revolver at the young Marine. Paige fired a burst as a response, missing, then resumed the charge. The officer dropped his gun for a samurai sword. Paige fired again, hitting both the officer and the blade, ending the threat. The riflemen came rushing down behind him, yelling like warriors, their voices rising over the smoke and gunfire. By the time they hit the bottom of the ridge, the enemy was gone. The fight was over. In December 1942, just months after the brutal defense of Guadalcanal, Mitchell Paige was plucked from the muddy trenches and promoted to second lieutenant, a rare field commission born from necessity and valor. The battlefield had become his resume. His leadership under fire had turned the tide in one of the war's most harrowing early engagements. And now the Marine Corps recognized it with rank. Just 5 months later, on May 21, 1943, in a quiet ceremony held in Australia, Paige stood before General Alexander Vandegrift, Commandant of the Marine Corps, to receive the Medal of Honor. The citation was clear. When every man in his machine gun platoon had been downed or wounded, Paige had held the line alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese assaults almost by himself. His defense helped decide the fate of Henderson Field, the critical foothold that anchored the Allied effort in the Pacific. Despite the accolades, Paige remained grounded. When he received the medal, he said, quote, "This Medal of Honor belongs to 33 people. The greatest heroes were those guys who didn't survive." That humility became a through line in Paige's life. He carried the medal, but also the memory of those who hadn't made it home. Years later, that same humility would carry him through visits to the White House, meetings with presidents, and speaking engagements across the country, not as a war hero, but as a representative of the quiet courage shared by every Marine who stood their ground in the Pacific mud. The Medal of Honor didn't send Mitchell Paige home. He wouldn't have accepted it if it did. Paige didn't consider the war finished, not for him. He returned to the Pacific without ceremony, trading the spotlight for more hardship and more battles. Through 1943, Mitchell Paige remained in the thick of the Pacific War. He, along with the 1st Marine Division, shipped out again, this time toward the next axis of assault in the Solomon and Bismarck archipelagos. Later that year, they landed on New Britain, part of the larger New Guinea campaign. There, on the volcanic coast of Cape Gloucester, the terrain was worse than anything they'd seen. Jungle rot devoured boots. The rain never stopped. Every trail turned into mud. Every ridge became a trap, held by dug-in Japanese defenders. Their objective was to secure Cape Gloucester's airfields and eliminate resistance on the Western Peninsula. Paige, now a combat-tested leader, pushed his platoon forward while under heavy artillery fire and constant sniper attacks. The enemy held the high ground and used it well, turning the ridgeline into natural fortresses. Fighting was often up close and brutal. When the Marines stalled, Paige scouted ahead alone. When morale dipped, he rallied them forward. His concern was never just about taking ground. It was about bringing his men back alive. Worn down by years of tropical warfare, Paige was finally rotated back to the U.S. in mid-1944. But resting didn't fit into his schedule. At Camp Lejeune, Camp Matthews, and later at MCRD San Diego, he turned his battlefield lessons into drills, shaping a new generation of Marines who would prepare for Okinawa and Iwo Jima. He trained them not with theatrics, but with quiet authority, delivering orders like someone who had seen what waited on the other side of the ocean. On November 1, 1959, Paige was placed on the Marine Corps Disability Retired list and promoted to colonel. By war's end, he'd survived some of the harshest campaigns in the Marine Corps' history. In his later years, Mitchell Paige undertook a different kind of mission, tracking down those who wore or sold the Medal of Honor without having earned it. For him, the medal was sacred. He saw imposters not as harmless pretenders, but as an insult to every Marine who had fought and sacrificed for the real thing. In 1998, he reached a new generation in an unexpected way. Hasbro released a G.I. Joe Medal of Honor figure based on him. Kids across the country tore open action figure boxes to find a real Marine among the make-believe. The Heinz History Center even displayed the toy beside Paige's actual Medal of Honor, a sharp reminder that sometimes history and legend wear the same face. Paige passed away in 2003 at 85. He went out the way he lived, steady, proud, and a Marine to the end. Laid to rest with full honors, he remains a poignant reminder that sometimes history can hinge on the determination of a single person who refuses to give up.